The morning the flood took the bridge and cut the Mercer place off from town, with a sick child burning up in the back room, it was Tabitha Reed, the wife folks said had been hired more than married, good for mending and nothing else, who read the river right and got the boy across when 3 grown men swore it couldn't be done. If this story moves you, do me a kindness before we go any further. Subscribe to the channel, follow it all the way to the end because the part that will stay with you comes late, and leave the name of your town down in the comments so we can all watch together how far this story travels. Now let me carry you back to where it truly began, to a cold grey morning some months before that flood, when Tabitha Reed stepped down off the stage in the town of Cold Springs to marry a man who'd advertised for a seamstress more than a bride. She was a big woman, and she'd been big her whole life, broad through the shoulders, and full and strong, in a way the world had only ever called too much. She was 37 that spring, and she'd been hearing the same words since she was a girl, too large for the school bench, too big, too dark, too plain. No man's going to want all that for a wife, and the best you'll do is be useful to somebody. Useful. That was the word that had followed her like a shadow her whole life. The kindest word anyone ever spared her, and she'd built a life out of it, because it was the only foothold the world would give her. Tabitha had folded the crueler words up small a long time ago and put them somewhere they couldn't reach her face, because she'd learned young that a still face was the one thing nobody could take from her by force. So she stepped down off that stage with her face calm and her eyes already moving, reading the town and the man come to meet her the way most folks read a letter, and she saw at once, before he said a word, that the tall, stoop-shouldered man waiting by the wagon had buried something heavy and recent, that the black band on his sleeve was for a wife not long in the ground, and that he had not advertised for love, and would have been frightened of it if he had. The advertisement had said it plain, and Tabitha had answered it with her eyes open. Widower with 3 children needs a wife who can sew, cook, and keep a house, no romantic expectations, a decent home offered in fair exchange for honest work. It was not a proposal. It was very nearly a hiring, and Tabitha had taken it as such, because at 37, a woman of her size and her color did not get proposals, she got positions, and a position with a ring attached and 3 children to mother was more than the world had ever offered her before. She had spent her last careful dollars on the stage ticket west, and on the long ride, she had taught herself not to hope for anything beyond a roof and a use, because hope, in her experience, was just the long way around to being hurt. Silas Mercer was his name, and he met her without a smile, not unkind but closed up tight as a fist, and he loaded her trunk and said only, "It's a long way out to the place. The children are expecting somebody who can sew," as though that were the whole of what she was, as though that were the whole of what he dared to need. The 3 children were waiting on the porch of a house that was visibly coming apart, and Tabitha read them in a glance, the way she read everything. The oldest, a girl of 12 named Pearl, standing stiff and wary and furious with her arms crossed, mothering the younger 2, and hating the stranger who'd come to replace the mother she'd lost. A boy of 8, hollow-eyed and silent, and the littlest, a girl of 5, named Rose, who looked at Tabitha with the simple openness of a child too young to have learned the world's lessons yet. And Tabitha read the house too, in that same glance. The roof shedding shingles, the chimney cracked and smoking wrong so the whole place was slowly poisoning itself with wood smoke. The well rope frayed near to parting, the kitchen garden gone to weeds, a home that had been falling apart around a grieving man, and 3 lost children for the better part of a year, because nobody left in it had the heart or the knowing to hold it together. Silas Mercer thought he'd brought home a seamstress. Tabitha saw inside the first hour that what this place needed was somebody who could rebuild it from the foundation up, and she had spent 37 years quietly becoming exactly that, whether or not a single soul had ever thought to ask. She did not wait to be told what she was allowed to do. That had never been in her. The first morning, while Silas was out with the cattle, she climbed up and looked at the chimney and found the crack that was venting smoke back into the house, and she had it patched with clay and stone by noon, and that night, the family breathed clean air in their own home for the first time in months. The second day she mended the well rope before it could part and dropped the bucket down the shaft. The third day, she was up on the roof herself, skirts and all, laying new shingles she'd split from a fallen oak, and that was where Silas Mercer found her when he came in early. His hired bride seamstress, a big woman balanced sure-footed on his roofline against the sky, nailing his house back together. He stood in the yard and stared. "I advertised for someone to sew," he said, and there was something lost in it, like a man whose careful small expectations had been upended. Tabitha looked down at him from the roof with her level eyes and said, "Plain, I can sew. I can also see your chimney was poisoning your children, and your roof was letting in the weather, and your well rope was a day from dropping your bucket down the hole. I'm not useless past a needle, Mr. Mercer. I'm not useless at all. You'll find that out if you let me." And she went back to her nailing, and Silas Mercer stood a long moment in the yard, and then, slow, he climbed up to hand her shingles. The oldest girl, Pearl, fought her the longest and the hardest, because Pearl had loved her dead mother fierce, and saw in this large, capable stranger a usurper come to take the mother's place, and she met every kindness with a wall. Tabitha didn't push. She knew that grief in a child the way she knew her own bones, the rage that's really fear-wearing armor, because Tabitha had worn that same armor her whole life, and knew it could not be argued down, only outlasted with patience. So she didn't try to mother Pearl. She just kept the house warm and the food good, and she left the girl her space, and she let Pearl watch her be steady, day after day, the one thing that child needed most and trusted least, somebody who didn't leave. The boy, Caleb, came around quicker, won by the simple animal comfort of a clean, warm house and full meals. And little Rose attached herself to Tabitha's skirts inside a week and would not be pried loose, and Tabitha let her stay there and felt something crack open in her chest that she'd kept shut for 37 years. The old hired man, a flint-faced one named Gideon, who'd worked the Mercer cattle since Silas was a boy, watched the big woman rebuild the place and said nothing. But the morning he saw her splint a calf's broken leg with the same sure hands she used on the roof, he grunted, which from Gideon was a hymn, and started saving his few words for her. The trouble had a name, and the name was Horace Bell, and he came calling Tabitha's second month in a fine buggy with a matched team, a soft, heavy man with a gold watch chain and a smile that sat on his face like something set there with a trowel. He owned the bank in Cold Springs, and he came, he said, to pay his respects to the new Mrs. Mercer. He climbed down and looked around the mending Mercer place, the way a man looks at property he's already counting. And when his eyes found Tabitha at the garden, his trowel smile widened in a way that put a cold finger down her spine. "Silas," he called, warm as a parlor stove. "I'd heard you'd remarried, but I confess I didn't expect such a, generously built helpmeet." He said it like she was stock at auction. Then, directly to her, loud and slow, as though she were simple, "You're a long way from anywhere that have you, aren't you, big girl?" Tabitha looked at him with her level eyes and her still face, and gave him exactly nothing, not a flush, not a flinch, because she'd met 100 Horace Bells, and long ago stopped paying men like him the toll of a reaction. But she filed him away whole, every honeyed, poisoned word, because she'd understood the thing it would take the grieving man beside her weeks to see. Bell hadn't come to pay respects. He'd come to measure how close the widower was to going under, because Silas Mercer owed the bank, and the Mercer place sat on a creek with water rights worth 10 times the land, and a grieving man with 3 children and a mortgage was the easiest mark in the county. What Bell could not have guessed was that Tabitha Reed could read a ledger the way she read a roofline. She'd kept books for a black church, and then a milliner, and then a freight office across the years, until the freight man's new partner decided a woman of her size and color at the front desk hurt the firm's standing, and numbers had never once in her life laughed at her or called her too much. So when she set the chaotic Mercer accounts in order, the drawer of unpaid bills and half-read bank papers that Silas, drowning in grief, had let pile up unexamined for a year. She found inside, a few evenings, at the dead wife's sewing table, in the long gold light, the whole shape of the trap. Bell's bank held the mortgage, and the interest had been quietly creeping upward, by small adjustments, buried in papers Silas signed without reading, grief-blind, trusting. And there were new papers Bell kept sending out for signature, described in soothing words as refinancing on easier terms, that Tabitha read with care and saw were the opposite. They pledged the water rights as separate collateral, carved off from the land, so that when the inflated note came due, Bell could seize the water alone and leave Silas a ranch with no creek, worthless, while Bell sold the water to the new mill, going up downstream for a fortune. The deadline was the spring note, and it was close. Tabitha sat very still, with that knowledge under her broad, scarred hands. Then she went to find Silas, because some things a body does, because it's just plain right. He didn't want to believe it. Not because she was a woman, and not for how she was made, she'd give him that always, that he never once doubted her figures for those reasons, but because Horace Bell had carried the Mercer family through the hard winter when his wife was dying and there was no money for medicine, and Silas Mercer was a man who held on to a debt of gratitude well past the point it served him, because gratitude was one of the few clean things the grief had left him. He helped me when she was sick, Silas said, quiet. The way she was learning he got quiet when something cut deep. He's been bleeding you ever since, Tabitha said, gentle but plain, with interest crept up on papers you signed without reading. And now he's trying to carve your water off your land, so he can take it and sell it to the mill. And I can show you in your own papers, laid side by side. But the papers alone won't be enough against a man who owns the bank. We'll need to prove the water rights were never lawfully separated from the deed, and for that we need the original land grant, the one filed when this place was first claimed. She laid it out at the sewing table, plain and slow, and from the doorway where she thought no one could see her, the girl Pearl listened to every word. She told Silas they'd go careful and quiet, give nothing away, let Bell keep believing the place was the easy dying thing he took it for. And Silas Mercer looked at this woman he'd married to, sew and mend, who was instead saving everything he had left, and he said the thing that mattered more than all the rest. He said, "All right, Tabitha," her first name, in his low voice, the first time he'd said it soft, and she felt it land somewhere the old armor didn't reach. The weeks that followed were the rebuilding weeks, and Tabitha knew enough of her own life to know that good never lasted and was only the breath drawn before the next hard thing. The house came whole under her hands, roof tight, chimney true, garden bearing, the children fed and clean and slowly unclenching. Even Pearl thawed, an inch at a time, until the evening the girl brought Tabitha her dead mother's sewing basket, the one nobody had touched in a year, and asked, in a small hard voice that cost her everything, if Tabitha would teach her to mend proper, the way her mother never got to finish teaching her. And Tabitha, who understood exactly what it cost that child to offer up her mother's basket to the stranger she'd sworn to hate, took it gentle as a sacrament, and said, "I'd be honored to. And we'll keep every one of her stitches she taught you already, and add mine to them, and that way she's still in the work." And the girl cried, finally, the year of held-back grief breaking loose, and let the big woman hold her, and that was the day the war ended, and something better began. Gideon came around full, and little Rose was Tabitha's shadow, and even Caleb laughed again. The good weeks. Then the rains came early and hard. The creek rose to a brown, roaring flood, and the worst of it came when little Rose took a fever in the night that climbed and climbed, until Tabitha knew the child needed the doctor in town, or she'd lose her. And the flood had taken the bridge, and the ford was a death trap, and 3 grown men, Silas and Gideon and a neighbor, stood at the water's edge in the grey dawn and said it could not be crossed. But Tabitha had been reading that creek for weeks, the way she read everything, and she knew it now better than men who'd lived beside it for years, knew where the channel ran deep, and where a gravel bar made a shallow shelf the brown water hid. knew which bend the current cut hardest and which it spared. She didn't argue with the men. She took the fevered child wrapped tight against her own broad chest, and she took the rope and had them anchor it to the big cottonwood, and she walked into that flood along the gravel shelf she'd read in the lay of the banks, broad and steady and sure-footed, where a smaller frame would have been swept off its feet, the brown water dragging at her to the waist, and she carried Rose across to the town side and got her to the doctor while the men were still arguing it couldn't be done. The child lived. The doctor said another hour would have been too late, and Silas Mercer, who had come across behind her on the rope, white-faced and shaking, looked at his wife, standing soaked and steady on the far bank, with his daughter's life in her arms, and he did the thing he had never once done since she came. He put his arms around her, both of them dripping and trembling, and held on, and said into her wet shoulder, "I don't know what we did before you. I don't want to know." First embrace. It landed where nothing had landed in years. But Horace Bell had not grown rich by letting drowning men learn to swim, and word reached him that the Mercer place was mended, and its books set straight, and the widower no longer signing whatever was put before him. And he understood, the way his kind always eventually understands, that the thing that had changed was the big quiet woman doing sums at the dead wife's sewing table. So Bell did what men like Bell always do. He went after what he took to be the soft spot. He started in town, soft and grieved and reasonable, a word here and a word there, that Silas Mercer had married a colored woman barely a year after laying his white wife in the ground, that it was a scandal and a shame to the children, that those 3 motherless babies were being raised by a creature decent folk wouldn't have in the house. All of it, the way Bell said everything, with a sorrowing shake of the head, as Christian concern, as kindness. The talk went through Cold Springs like fire through dry grass, and it found its way to Mrs. Lavinia Cruz, who ran the church guild, and the school, and the settled opinion of every respectable woman in the county, and who drove out to the Mercer place to tell Tabitha Reed, to her still and level face, exactly what the decent people had decided she was. Lavinia Cruz was not a wicked woman. Tabitha saw that plain, even standing in the yard taking the sharp edge of it, because Tabitha had spent a lifetime learning to tell wicked from wounded, and what stood before her, in its stiff grey poplin, with its trembling righteous chin, was a frightened soul who had buried 3 babies in a single dreadful winter and had nothing left to hold to but the rules, because the rules were the last thing in her ravaged world that hadn't betrayed her. So Tabitha didn't fight her. She let the woman say her whole piece, scandal and propriety, and the poor motherless children. And then, in the quiet after, Tabitha said only, 3, wasn't it? The winter, the diphtheria came through. I heard it took 3 from one house, and I never knew, till just now, it was yours. Lavinia Cruz went white to the lips, and her hard mouth shook. How? Because I know the look of a woman who buried more than a body's meant to, and made herself stone so she could go on standing, Tabitha said, gentle as she'd ever said anything to a living soul. I carried a fevered child across a flood last week, so she wouldn't be a 4th one buried, Mrs. Cruz. I am not here to harm those children. I am here because they had nobody to hold the house together, and now they do. You think whatever you have to think of me to get through your day, but don't you carry the lie that I'd do those babies harm, because you and I both know to the bone what it costs to lose one, and I will not have my name set down beside your grief. Lavinia Cruz turned and left without one more word, but she did not drive straight home. She sat a long while at the end of the lane, and Tabitha, watching, understood that something had moved in the woman that would not move back. The reckoning came, the day the spring note fell due, the way Tabitha had known it would, in town, in front of everyone. Bell had arranged it all to a head. The note due at the bank, the millmen come up from downstream to take delivery of the water rights Bell meant to seize. The county gathered to see the Mercer place go under, and Bell presiding from the bank steps, with his trowel smile, certain. He stood before the gathered town and the millmen and said, warm and grieved, that poor Silas Mercer's note was due and unpaid, that the water rights pledged as collateral would pass to the bank, and that it was a sorrowful necessity of business. And Tabitha Reed stepped up out of the crowd, in a good dress she'd sewn with her own hands. The dead wife's stitches and her own worked together in it, and she said in a voice that carried clean across the whole dusty square, "Before you take one drop of that water, you'd best hear whether it was ever lawfully yours to take, all of it." Out loud. She had the original land grant. She'd found it 3 nights before, not in any place Belle could have guessed, but folded inside the back of the dead wife's family Bible, where it had been kept safe for 40 years. The open loop she'd been turning over since she first read the deed and saw the water rights had been described wrong. And the grant, in the territory's own hand, proved that the Mercer water rights were appurtenant to the land, bound to it by the original patent, and could not lawfully be carved off and pledged or sold separate from the deed, no matter what papers Belle had slipped beneath a grieving man's pen. Tabitha read it out to the square, plain and slow as scripture read to children. The patent, the binding of the water to the land, and then Belle's papers beside it, the creeping interest, the unlawful separation he'd tried to engineer, the mill sale he'd lined up to profit from a theft. "You never refinanced an old friend's debt," Tabitha said, and she'd gone quiet now. She didn't need to be loud. The whole square had fallen still, as held breath. "You used a grieving man's blind trust to try and steal the water off his land. Water the law says can't be moved from it, so you could sell it to these gentlemen and leave 3 motherless children on a dry ranch worth nothing. You bet the whole thing on a widower too sunk in sorrow to read, and a wife you reckoned was good for nothing but a needle. You bet wrong on both." And Horace Bell, who had smiled through every word, made the one mistake men like him always make at the last. He let the smile slide off his face. He looked at the big black woman who had just laid him open before the entire county, and his soft features curdled into what was truly under them, and he said the ugly, contemptuous thing he actually felt, said it out loud, before he could catch it, and the whole square heard exactly what Horace Bell was beneath the watch chain, and there was no smiling it back. It was Lavinia Cruz who moved first. She came out of that crowd in her stiff grey poplin and planted herself square beside Tabitha in the square, and she said, to Belle, to the millmen, to the whole staring county, and most of all to her own self, "I will witness that grant and those papers both. I keep the guild's accounts, and I can read a legal hand as well as any man here, and I will swear to what this woman has shown us before any judge in the territory." Then old Gideon stepped up on Tabitha's other side, hat in his hands. Then a rancher named Doyle, whose own water bell had been eyeing the same way, and who finally saw the shape of it. Then a dozen more, until it was no longer one woman alone against the bank steps. It was the whole of Cold Springs standing up at once for what was right. The millmen, wanting no part of buying stolen water under a clouded title, withdrew their offer on the spot. The circuit judge voided Bell's separated collateral papers as contrary to the original patent, struck down the crept-up interest, and bound Bell over for fraud on the strength of the grant Tabitha had found and read. Bell lost the bank and his good name inside the season. The Mercer note was settled honest, and the water stayed bound to the land where it belonged. And Silas Mercer stood in that dusty square, with little Rose on his hip, and Pearl's hand in his, and Caleb pressed to his side, and looked at the wife he'd married to sow, who had instead saved his children and his land, and his whole broken world, and for the first time since he'd buried his first wife, in front of all of Cold Springs, Silas Mercer smiled wide enough to break your heart. The home came whole, the way a thing does when somebody who loves it finally tends it right. The Mercer place mended and then prospered, the water safe, the herd grown, the house Tabitha had rebuilt with her own hands, becoming the warmest in the valley, a hidden gem, folks said, that had near fallen to ruin and come back better than before. Tabitha kept the books and the house and the land, and old Gideon took her word as gospel and was glad to, and Lavinia Cruz came to Sunday dinner and taught the children their letters at the kitchen table and never spoke of propriety again, because she'd learned at last what the word was meant to mean, and the two women who'd each buried more than their share became, in time, the unlikeliest of friends. And Pearl grew up tall and steady, and sewed a fine seam, her mother's stitches, and Tabitha's worked together in everything she made, and she came to call Tabitha, not mother, for she'd had a mother and honored her, but a name of her own choosing that meant just as much. And little Rose, who'd been carried across a flood, called Tabitha Mama Plain, and never knew there'd been a time she hadn't. And Caleb turned to her for everything the way a boy turns toward the sun. Silas was a slow man, and grief had made him slower, and Tabitha had spent her whole life braced to be useful, and never wanted. So the two of them came to each other, the long, careful way that wary people do, through seasons of work, shoulder to shoulder, through 1,000 small kindnesses, neither one ever announced. The marriage that had begun as a hiring, a fair exchange of work for a roof, with no love expected on either side, had become something neither of them had dared to name, until there came an evening in the second autumn, the near field gone gold under a low sun, the two of them on the porch of the house she'd rebuilt watching the children chase fireflies in the yard, when Silas Mercer said more words at one time than Tabitha had ever heard out of him. He said he'd advertised for a seamstress because he'd been too broken to ask for anything more, too sure that the part of him that could love had gone into the ground with his first wife. He said he'd been wrong. He said he'd watched this woman climb onto his roof the first morning and rebuild his falling down house and set his ruined books to rights and carry his baby girl across a killing flood and stand up in a town square where the world expected her to keep still and save his children's whole future, and that somewhere in all of it, he'd come to understand the thing he should have seen the first morning on the roof, that every quality the county had mocked in her bigness, her color, her too-muchness, every single thing the world had shamed her for and called merely useful, was the exact set of things that had saved his entire family. Her broad shoulders were the measure of what she could carry, and she had carried his daughter through the flood and his whole household through the dark. Her stubbornness was the reason she'd rebuilt what any sensible soul would have walked away from, and he did not want 1 ounce of her made different. "I married you to sew," he said, slow and plain, the long gold light running across both their faces, "and I have been ashamed of that small asking every day since I learned what you are. I'd not insult you now by offering less than the whole of my heart, late as it comes. I watched a man try to own this whole valley by treating folks as things to be used, water and land and people all the same, and I'd sooner lie down in the ground than be the likes of him, and I'll not have our marriage be a using either. So I'm asking you, not as a hiring and not as a bargain, I'm asking if you'll stay because you choose it. Your name on the deed beside mine, because you earned every board of this place, your say equal to mine in all of it, the children already yours in every way that matters. Stay, because you want us, Tabitha, not because the world left you no other door, not because useful was all anybody ever offered you, because you choose it." And Tabitha Reed, who had come west to be useful and nothing more, who had been told her whole long life that she was too big and too dark and too much for any good thing to ever want her, who had folded 10,000 cruel words up small and carried them across half a country in a single trunk, sat in the long gold light beside a quiet, decent man on the porch of a home she had raised up whole with her own 2 hands, and she felt the old armor come loose all the way at last and slip down off her broad, strong shoulders, and she found that she did not need it anymore. She was not too much. She was not too little. She was not merely useful. She was exactly, finally, and for the first time in her whole life, enough, and wanted, and chosen. She thought of the stage, and the advertisement, and the word useful that had shadowed her all her days. She thought of every word ever thrown at her like a stone, and then she let all of it go, the way you let go of a weight you no longer have to carry, and she turned to Silas Mercer in the gold light and gave him the only answer that had ever been true, the answer she'd been stitching toward her whole hard life, without once knowing the road led here. "Yes," she said. "Just that. Yes."